Hi, I'm David, and I'm the host of Vintage Comic Show and Tell. And today, we're fortunate enough to have Richard Evans. Hi, Richard.
Hi,
And he's the owner of Bedrock Comics. We're going to chat with him a few minutes and talk about collecting comic books and how Richard started on this journey of comic books that's led to his future of being involved in comic books and having 6 stores. So how did you get started reading comic books? How did comic books come into your life?
I collected baseball cards and all kinds of stuff, but I'd never bought any comic books. And we had a little convenience store near the house, and one day my cousin and we had been at the pool in our neighborhood and rode our bikes over there to go get some, I don't know, gum or whatever. And this one particular day, the spinner rack just caught my eye. I mean, I can remember that day clear as a bell. I bought Iron Man 46 and Hulk 150 and Amazing Adventures 11 and the first Beast. And yeah, I from then on, like every day I was going back over there. And I was in 3rd grade at that time. I took some comics to school and started talking with a friend of mine whose older brother collected comics. So rode my bike over to his house, and he had a flyer for something called the HCCA, which was the Houston Comic Collectors Association. It was like a little mini con, but it was I think the second Tuesday of every month, these guys that collected comics would meet at a place in downtown Houston. So my dad took me and my friend Joe Fenton. We went down there to the HCCA meeting. I was 9 years old, and it was all these old dudes with comics. And
Wow.
we went in. I started digging through boxes. I bought an Iron Man 1 for 50 cents and thought it was the greatest thing in the world. And
It was.
and from there, I heard about the mini cons and Houston Con and stuff, and started going to the conventions. And there was a comic book store here in town called Roy's Memory Shop. Roy Benario, he was kind of the grandfather of comics. He opened his first. He first started selling comics through a store in a record store that he had in 1967, but he opened his comic store in 1970, and it was kind of the center of the action here. And Roy's still around. He's in his mid 80s. He's revered in Houston comic lore. But anyhow, went to Roy's and went to the conventions, and from there I used to, at the shows, I was immediately enamored with Golden Age for whatever reason. At that first HCCA meeting, I saw Captain Marvel 17, and it was the first Golden Age book I ever saw. I thought, man, it's just really cool with this painted Captain Marvel cover and stuff. And I gravitated to the booths at those shows that had Golden Age at them. Houston had the distinction of having the biggest comic collector in the world at that time here. His name was Burl Rowe. He was an attorney. He wrote all the water district law for the state of Texas, pretty much.
Wow.
But he's a pretty well-known attorney here, but he collected comics, and he was one of the first guys to spend $1,000 on a comic book. I think he got some national press for buying the copy of Detective 27 for $2,000 from Bob Bierbaum in like 1972. It made the news. And through a weird kind of small world, it turns out Burl went to college with my mother's cousin. And my mom and Carol were still close. And so whenever Carol and her husband would come to town, Burl and his wife would come over to the house and visit. And he found out that, the first time he came over, you're a comic collector. He brought these notebooks of old comics and showed me stuff. And so we started going over to his house, and my dad thought this comic stuff was great. So, we'd go over to Burl's and sit in his office and look at his books. Well, Burl's the guy that loaned Chuck Rosansky the money to buy the Mile High collection.
Right.
And so one day we go, you may want to come over and see some cool comics. Sure. We go over there, and stacked on the floor were these stacks of mint Golden Age books. He was the first guy to, he loaned Chuck the money. He was the first guy to get books out of there. And he had just these, 6 or 7 big stacks of beautiful Golden Age books.
Yeah, we have to stop at that. So how old were you then?
I was like 13. It was 76.
Yeah. So how amazing to be able to see that collection, and it's been talked about a lot, and we'll have some information about the Mile High collection, which is what we're talking about. So as you were looking through that, we were chatting last night, and you said that you thought that was kind of the way it goes, is that people find these big collections.
I didn't have any experience with, you go by what you're exposed to, and I'm looking at all this stuff thinking, wow, if we've got this in Houston, imagine what they've got at stores in New York or California or stuff. I had been at that point subscribing to the Comics Buyer's Guide,
right?
So I see all these ads for all these places around the country that are selling comics, and so I'm thinking that's just the way it is. Mint golden age. So that's what I started trying to collect, but man, it got harder than.
So were you already condition conscious at that age?
Yeah, David, I can't explain it, but yes.
Because I'm curious. Me and my brother are. Mm-hmm. Everyone isn't. There are some people that condition is not as important to them. They want to own the book, and I'm not begrudging that. I don't know when it happened, but at some point, condition became really important to us.
I've tried to explain it to people, but that first day when I looked at the spinner rack, I knew what the issue numbers were. Do you know what I mean?
You could read the book.
I read that first, issue of Hulk, and it had some attributions at the bottom of some panels that referenced back to older issues, and I immediately wanted to go get those older issues.
Oh, interesting.
And so and then when I got these, that was the seeing a bunch of golden age stuff and filling in the history points of all that stuff.
Right.
So there was that, but I always wanted to get them, and just as I wanted them to look like they came out on the newsstand. So that's what if they're all beat up and stuff, they don't look like they came out on the newsstand, and I've always wanted them to look like they came out new.
I think I have that same type of ideal that I want to look like it just got printed.
Right.
It was hard to achieve.
And
if you don't mind, I'm going to grab one of these. So I was looking at one of these. I'm not familiar with this. I might have seen these before, but if I have, it's been so long, I forgot.
Jim Sterenko got into publishing. He was doing comics, and he's always been a comic fan. He's a big-time comic collector. He collects pulps. He has an incredible collection of original pulp art. He's just
I didn't know that.
He's a fan, just like all of us.
Okay.
And he's one of the great comic book artists. But in 1970, he did this 2-volume thing that was kind of a labor of love for him, called the Sterenko History of Comics. And it was supposed to be a much longer thing, but at the time it cost him so much for him to, I don't think he recouped his money. I don't know exactly, but they did 2 volumes, and they covered the Golden Age. And there's chapters on all the different Golden Age publishers, and each chapter would have just all these photos. And so that was the first time I'd seen timelies before, Marvel Mysteries and Captain Americas and Human Torches.
Where did you find? You found these at a convention?
I got them at a convention.
Yeah.
And so, like I said, they came out in 1970. I probably got my first set probably 72 or 73. I was probably 10 or 11 years old. My original set is long gone, but I always have a volume around just because I just think they're awfully cool. And, prior to the Gerber Photojournal guides, that was the only place I'd seen a whole bunch of photos.
I'm curious where they were able to get all the photographs from these.
I think it's from his collection.
Oh, from his collection.
Yeah.
Wow. So he's that knowledgeable.
Yeah,
he really knew what was going on.
Absolutely.
Well, he is an incredible artist. There's some Sterenko covers that I think are second to none. He stood on his own just as an artist. 1970. This predates most of the publications about Golden Age.
Yeah, there were some reprints. Jules Pfeiffer did a book in the 60s called The Great Comic Book Heroes.
Okay.
It came out in 66 that had a lot of biographical information about creators, and then would reprint a story or two. And there were a number of people involved in the industry who were documenting the history of comics. One of the big ones was Jerry DeFusio, and I've heard my kind of pride and joy thing that I own is the original art to the cover of Action 15.
Right.
And one of the reasons that cover even exists is that Jerry DeFusio, who was an editor at Mad but a big comic historian, was going around and searching out old comic creators, and the artist for that cover was a guy named Fred Gardner. And Fred Gardner had done art for DC in the mid 1930s. And, before the superhero stuff was really starting, he was doing things for New Adventure and More Fun and covers like that. And then he did a few of the early action covers. But the story goes that he wasn't real, DC wasn't real solvent money-wise. Yeah. So they were kind of late in paying, and he was hunting for other artwork, and so they allowed him to keep some of the covers that he did to use in a portfolio to get other illustration work. Well, by the 1960s, he was out of comics, and he was a postal carrier on Long Island. Jerry DeFusio tracked him down and went to his house and interviewed him and talked with him, and they were talking about stuff, and he said, "Do you still have any of your art?" Sure enough, he had this portfolio that he had, and it had the cover of Action. There were a couple of New Adventure covers, but there was a cover of Action 15 and 16. And 16 is that French Foreign Legion cover, beautiful cover. But 15 is a Superman cover. And right now, it's the earliest known existing Superman cover.
So that's the first Superman cover in Action?
No. Superman was on the cover of Action 1, 7, 10, 13, 15.
Right.
But those first four are not known to exist. They may be in a closet somewhere.
As original art.
The original art.
Right.
Yeah, the original art for them is not known to exist.
I understand.
So,
yeah.
So anyhow, because he, tracked him down, and that art survived and ended up, being... DeFusio agented a sale for him to, some comic art collectors in the New York area, and then they traveled around, and I ended up getting it through an auction. But it's just cool that it's cool that it even exists to me.
Pretty happy to have that piece?
Yeah, a little. A little.
So when you started out collecting from the newsstand and you grabbed a bunch of Marvels, how has your collecting changed over the years? As it went on, were you reading DCs as well? Did you start to branch into everything?
I was mainly a Marvel guy, but I did read Batman. When the Marshall Rogers detective issues came out, they were kind of a changing thing for me, because I felt like that was the first time I read adult comics. I don't know. Looking back,
Sure.
Those were they were just great to me. Marvel, DC, I read a lot of the black and white independent stuff from the, early 80s, Mr. X and Fish Police and all that. I read a ton of stuff, and I started working in comic stores early on. Burl ended up opening a comic store in '78, so I was working in comic stores during that early time when distribution was just starting, and we were reading everything that was coming out. For the old stuff, I collected Fantastic Four, I collected Timelies, and my goal was always to get a complete run of all the Marvel stuff from the 1940s. When I ended up opening my store in '90, my first store, I decided that I couldn't collect Silver Age anymore. I didn't want to compete with my customers,
Right.
I didn't want to compete with myself. So I sold all my Silver Age, but I kept the real early Golden Age, and over the years, that's been what I've continued to collect is, Golden Age and esoteric 10-cent cover price stuff.
Okay.
It's just, it's been a fun passion. I still say the best comics ever printed were, the first 60 issues of Fantastic Four, but I can't collect them anymore. So,
but you've had them.
I've had a few of them. Yeah. It seems like we buy runs all the time. I've had some real nice ones, but, I don't want to lament, having sold them either. So.
But you still feel the same about them.
I go back and I'll still get out the Marvel Masterworks and go back and read them, or pull when I get runs. I just go back and read that series, particularly 40 to 60. They're just great. I could read FF51 over and over and over. This man, this monster, that story. It's a great comic.
I own that and haven't read it, so I need to read that
Definitely.
book.
It's one of the. There are some Pinnacle Marvel books, but that book at one time was voted the single greatest one-shot Marvel story.
Oh, interesting.
So there's an argument to be made that Spider-Man 31, 32, 33 are the greatest, Spider-Man story, or FF 48, 49, 50. And interestingly, those came out within months of each other. And it was just that period where, Stan Lee and Kirby and everybody, they were just at the top of their game.
Right.
And it's just, everything was great right in there. So.
When did you know, you think, in your life that comic books would be your future and career? Was there a point?
I went to college planning to go to law school.
Okay.
And it went to Austin, went to UT, but I was selling comics at shows kind of to pay for school and do stuff. And while I was in Austin, one of the old HCCA guys here, who's passed, his name was Ken Ladd. Ken was a Captain Marvel collector, and he had pretty much a run of Captain Marvels and Whizzes. And I had heard from somebody that Ken had sold his comic collection to a guy that had a shop here. The shop, I won't mention their name, but anybody from Houston knows who they are. And so the guy that owns the shop is just, he's been around forever. The store's still open. He's just a gruff old turd. And so I came to, I drove back from Austin to Houston to go to the store to buy a couple of books because Ken had a couple of high grade, would have been pedigree Captain Marvels in his collection. So I get to this guy's shop, and at his store, when you walk in the front door, he had it was like a reception area in the front, and that's where his cash register was, and it was 2 stories tall. And then the shop went out in the back. And behind his cash register, he had all those Captain Marvels on the wall, and they went up, up to the top. So he would need to get a ladder to get stuff down. So the 2 books that I wanted were way up there, and I said, can I see those, 2 Captain Marvels? And he goes, well, are you going to buy them? And I said, well, I came down here planning to buy them, but I want to look at them first. And he goes, well, if you're not gonna buy them, I'm not gonna get them down.
Wow.
And I said, well, if you're not getting them down, I guess I'm not gonna buy them. And I left, and I thought as I left, I'm in a comic book store having a miserable experience, and there's no reason anybody should ever go in a comic book store and have a bad experience. Should never happen. Shouldn't happen. And so that was pretty much when I decided to open a comic book store. This was going to be my thing. And so that was the game plan from then on. I managed a store in Albuquerque while I lived out there a couple of years. I, like I said, was doing conventions and different stuff, and came back after college, came back here and ran a store for a guy for a couple of years. And then I opened my first store in 90, and I did business with that guy after, because like I said, he's still open, and we had done some stuff together, and he knows exactly what, and it's kind of fun. It's kind of fun to say, you're the reason that I'm in business. I actually, in my office, have an action figure that I hired one of his old managers to come work for me, and he worked for me. He ran my mail order department for about 10 years. And when he retired, left, he went to go get another job. He had an action figure of his old boss on his desk. And I said, you got to leave that with me. So I have my action figure as a kind of inspiration.
That's awesome. So, yeah, that's an interesting story on the things that drive us to, or compel us to figure out how we want to do things.
Well, look, for so long, going to comic book stores, going to conventions, dealing with dealers, there are a bunch of wonderful people in this business. But there's also a lot of people in this business who started working in it because they didn't want to get a job anywhere else, or they didn't want to answer to anybody, or they didn't ever really approach it with any kind of professionalism. It was just, to do something different or whatever. And so for the longest time, there wasn't a lot of professionalism in comics retail, in any of the business aspects of comic books. I mean, it took forever as comic stores for us even to get any kind of terms of credit from the publishers, because they didn't want to do that, and they but that's the nature of business. You kind of got to do those things, and so that's really turned in the last 20 years, and
Right.
things are getting more and more professional, and every year there are improvements. But just the fact that customers started having a choice, and they could go to some guy that's going to be gruff and treat them like crap, or they can come into a store that's well lit and has a lot of selection and has staff that will treat them right and will go and hunt for things for them and do things. It's made a world of difference, and there's a reason why stores like ours are doing well. There are lots of chains around the country that are doing really well in retail right now, because they are professional and they run their stores right and they treat the customers right, and that's important with this stuff.
So you've been collecting the whole time that you've had stores as well?
Pretty much.
And I'm sure that the stores have changed a lot, because since you've had stores, eBay has started.
Sure.
CGC has started.
Right.
And then the internet blew up.
Right. And auction houses.
And so all the auction houses come to light.
And now influencers and whatnot, and, digital new comics, and Amazon selling stuff.
Right.
I mean, there are hurdles and things all the time. But from a retail standpoint, we compete with all that by what I call experiential retail.
Yep.
Having events, having creator signings, doing different kind of things, doing Facebook live sales and making events out of those and all that stuff. And from a collector standpoint, I love it now, because I can find pretty much anything that I want anytime that I want.
Right.
And there are so many things that are available now that I spent 40 years never even seeing one, and all of a sudden now you can kind of find one somewhere. I mean, the thrill is in the hunt, but if there's no object for your hunt, then it makes it hard. And
right.
You can kind of find stuff.
So you've been able to adapt, but I'm sure that the face of your business has changed a lot along the way.
It has. I mean,
were you ever just comics? Were in the beginning?
So when I initially opened in 90, we were a 50-50 card and comic store. I carried sports cards, but the sports card business, two things happened. The sports card business is ridiculous, because as a retailer of sports cards, all your customers want the rarest things, which are the things that you as a retailer can't get. So I would constantly have people coming in wanting to get things that I had no opportunity to get.
Right.
And so I just, it was so frustrating. And I went out to the Bay Area in 92 for WonderCon. And I had a friend out there, his name was Rory Root. He had a store in Berkeley called Comics Relief. And I'd talked with Rory before. I'd seen him at San Diego Con. I'd seen him at different shows. But I'd never been to a store before. And I walked into his store, and he had this cool store packed with every graphic novel, foreign editions of comics and graphic novels, magazines related to comics, tattoo magazines. He had everything related to this artwork and stuff that we love that most stores don't carry. And the place was packed. And it was an epiphany for me. I thought, I can make my store exist just dealing with the stuff that I really love. I don't need these other things to get the bills paid. I can jam it full of things that I dig. And so we came back. I took all the sports cards that I had and took them to a sports card shop, and just whatever you want, just give them to me. And we got rid of them, and we started loading up bookshelves with trade paperbacks and books and asterisks and Tintins and just anything that we could find that was cool comic related. and my sales exploded, and that was the big change. At that point, we had just opened our second store. The other thing that was going on with retail at that time was all the speculator stuff. You know, Image was starting and all of that, and we never kind of bought into that. So I didn't buy a bunch of books for wholesale. I wasn't, you know, people would come in and want to order 100 copies of Spawn, and I'm not a distributor. I can't, you know, I'm not going to do that. And when all that stuff went away, it didn't hurt us very much. But the fact that we had all this other cool stuff more than made up for the loss in any kind of business that we would have lost from doing that. And so we actually rode that late 90s kind of downturn in the comics industry. We rode it out really pretty well.
So you didn't buy 5,000 copies of X-Force One?
No, I didn't. No, I didn't. Fortunately, boy, man, we'll buy collections, and they'll be, go buy a storage unit from somebody, and we bought like 3,000 copies of Adventures of Superman 500, the white bagged Superman that some guy here in town thought was going to be the biggest thing.
500 copies.
I think I got them for a penny a piece or something. Just it was weight. He needed to get that stuff out. But there's just dead inventory. Mm-hmm. There's so much of that dead inventory that finally now is starting to turn around, and people are looking for some of it. But so much of that stuff is. I can't imagine that it's ever going to be worth much.
So a 7-year-old today that walks in someplace and sees comic books, what do you think the current state of comic books is? Do you feel like the artists today, the storytelling today, for what's going on in comic books, is it still a viable way to tell stories for kids?
Oh, absolutely.
Or is it more aimed towards adults today?
Think about it. We tend to look at new comics through our eyes because we're jaded. But a 7-year-old that comes in, it's all new to him.
Yeah.
So or her.
Right.
And this is their golden age. You know what I
That's
mean?
right.
So whatever they come in and see, they're gonna, and there's so much cool stuff out there. And it's not all in that packaging that we think of, the monthly floppies. I mean, kids' graphic novels has become a big new area of experimentation with creators, because kids' graphic novels are the highest checkout point in libraries now. Okay. And they're one of the biggest selling genres in bookstores. The biggest selling comic book, is a kid's graphic novel.
Right.
So there's just so much of that, and that's not something that grew up with. Yeah.
Not at all. We didn't grow up with variant covers, and now I've kind of switched because we're not talking about kids anymore. I don't think kids are as interested in that.
Not so much.
My grandson's looking at his story because I read comic books to my grandson, my 4-year-old grandson. And he likes Action Tank #1, and some of they're aimed towards young adults, but they're comic books. I mean, they still have the great stories, and stories about outer space, or quadricorns instead of unicorns, and he loves it. And he has a stack of
There's nothing like a good quadricorn.
He's a fan. He went home and told his parents about the quadricorn, and they're like, "A what?" They thought he had the word wrong. No, he was accurate. At 3 years old, he knew exactly what he was talking about. But there's still comic books out there that I think kids can get into, and it's interesting to see the market today, because it seems like there's so much more.
You think about the big change, and really the fundamental change in the whole comic thing is the media penetration of the movies and the entertainment stuff. So superhero movies and all that stuff are just almost ubiquitous with pop culture. And 30 years ago, our potential market was pretty thin, mostly male, mostly 18 to 35, and that is just this little segment of the population. And now it's nearly 100%. It could be just about anybody.
Right.
And there are products to appeal to just about anybody on
Right.
that spectrum. So between the toys, apparel, all the other stuff on top of the comic books themselves, which are the source material for all these movies and TV shows and stuff, I mean, it really makes it where people that are fans can transition into collectors super easy.
Right.
And that's where we see all this stuff with the variant covers and all that stuff appealing, because, you know, casual fans will start looking for things that are unique related to a character that appeals to them. And those are the things that they'll buy, maybe for investment, or maybe to, you know, put away, or maybe to show off.
Right.
And so it all kind of dovetails together where there's just this active market surrounding comics, from high-end collector, hardcore collector stuff to just really casual fans, but they're all involved in it. So.
Yeah, you know, on a small scale, I remember growing up and watching Superman, the 50s version of Superman with George Reeves.
Right.
And there were some shows, so there was still like there was still a media presence that had me go look for those things.
Sure.
Not like today, where you could have a super fan of MCU that could be reciting all these characters, never picked up a comic book, and they'll be coming into like, now look at comic books, where you can show somebody like, this is the first appearance of Wanda, X-Men 4, you know, and
Tim Burton Batman movie was the thing that paved the way for all of that, really.
Yeah,
because that was the first movie, comic related, that was really a big box office hit and had all of these other media tie-ins and product tie-ins with it that translated to actual comic book stores.
I thought it was Superman, but it was Batman.
Yeah, well, Superman, you know, Superman didn't really have any tie-in stuff. There weren't, you know, a lot of comic related things with the Superman movie, other than the movie itself.
I was so young when it came out. I just know I saw it.
I liked that movie, but it never really thrilled me, because when they showed the Action comic at the beginning of it, it wasn't a real comic. It just said Action Comics, and it had a train on it. It wasn't Action 1. It wasn't, you know, the Action Comics so I was like,
Yeah, it doesn't take much to ruin a comic collector's perspective when you show the wrong stuff. We're going to stop here. Thank you for sharing a little bit about your history in being in the comic book business, but also being a collector and what it was like growing up with comic books. And look forward to talking to you some more.
Sure.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Bye now.